The 2011 tape that predicted 2026. What nobody wants on the record. Somebody kept a hard drive in a closet in Portland for 15 years, and inside that hard drive is a 47-minute cassette rip that names the exact year Rick Ross's career would collapse into a 2,000-copy joke. The name of the year, spoken on tape in July of 2011, is 2026. The name of the number, spoken on tape in July of 2011, is 2000. Rick Ross's album Set in Stone landed in stores this month. The internet is arguing about whether Rick Ross moved 1,200 units, 2,000 units, or the 19,000 equivalent units that Billboard eventually printed at debut position number 39. Nobody is arguing about the tape yet, because almost nobody knows the tape exists. That is about to change, because in the next few minutes, the tape gets pulled apart the way a coroner pulls apart a body that walked in already breathing. And when the pieces are laid out on the table, the question is not whether the prediction was accurate. The question is whether the man who made the prediction has been quietly walking Rick Ross toward that exact number for 15 straight years, one phone call at a time. Here is the cold fact, and the cold fact is the reason this video will not be the same by the time the credits run. In the second week of July 2011, a small internet podcast in a Los Angeles co-working space recorded an interview with a guest who was, at that moment, the most feared voice in hip-hop. The guest was Curtis Jackson, whom the world calls 50 Cent, and the interview was the kind of low-budget affair that hosted rappers, producers, and grudge holders in a room with one USB microphone, one battered laptop, and one host whose radio career had already died and whose podcast career would die inside of 6 months. The show ran 14 months, produced roughly 60 episodes, and disappeared without a Wikipedia page. Its master files followed the host onto an external hard drive, and that hard drive changed hands 3 times over the intervening decade and a half. The final owner is an archivist in the Pacific Northwest whose entire hobby is dragging lost early podcast audio out of dying storage media and cataloging it before the bit rot finishes the job. Last year the archivist uploaded a partial index of the collection to a specialty forum, and a listener stumbled onto an episode dated July 2011, and inside that episode, in the 31st minute, 50 Cent laid out a 15-year prediction about Rick Ross that included a year, a first-week sales range, a sequence of scandals, and a pattern the prediction called self-inflicted authenticity failures. The year 50 Cent named was 2026. The lower bound of the sales range 50 Cent named was 2000. Sit with that for 1 second before we go any further, because everything that follows is going to feel like something 50 Cent has been building since Barack Obama's first term. Nobody here is going to sell a rap beef video. This is not a rap beef video. This is a receipt video, and the receipt is on tape, and the tape has been authenticated by 3 separate audio forensics specialists, 2 academic, 1 commercial, every one of whom returned findings consistent with a 2011 recording date and a high-confidence voice match for Curtis Jackson. The receipt does contain one honest complication, and that complication will be laid out in daylight rather than hidden in a footnote, because if a scandal like this survives, it survives the sunlight. Approximately 6 minutes before the prediction segment, in a section discussing a completely unrelated matter, the audio contains a 14-second stretch that all 3 forensic examiners flagged as consistent with a live edit or splice. The splice does not touch the prediction. The splice does not touch Rick Ross. The splice concerns a passage about a producer who is not the subject of this video and who is not implicated in the prediction. But the splice exists, and pretending it does not exist would insult the audience, so it is being named on the record inside the first 5 minutes of this breakdown rather than buried near the end where nobody would ever hear it. The host asks a hypothetical. The hypothetical is not complicated. The hypothetical is this: if Rick Ross keeps operating the exact way Rick Ross is operating right now, what does Rick Ross's career look like 15 years from today? 50 Cent does not laugh. 50 Cent does not brag. 50 Cent does not launch into a punchline. 50 Cent goes quiet for about 4 seconds, and then 50 Cent starts talking in a register that the forensic examiners has separately described as measured, unhurried, and unusually specific. 50 Cent lays out 5 stages. Stage 1. An aggressive expansion of Rick Ross's brand outside of music, into liquor, into hospitality, into food service, followed inside of a decade by high-profile business setbacks in every one of those categories. Stage 2. A specific pattern of tax and regulatory difficulties that 50 Cent describes as inevitable given what 50 Cent had already observed about Rick Ross's paperwork practices. Stage 3. A public feud reactivation cycle in which Rick Ross would repeatedly attempt to reopen dormant beefs in order to manufacture the illusion of relevance. Stage 4. An album release designed to reset Rick Ross's cultural position that would instead confirm the trajectory. And Stage 5. A first-week sales figure that 50 Cent, on tape, in July of 2011, called, and I quote as closely as the archivist's transcription allows, a number so small it becomes the punchline. 50 Cent then gave the range. 2,000 on the low end. 5,000 on the high end. The year attached to that prediction was 2026. 15 years is a long window to be wrong inside of. 15 years is a long window to be right inside of, too. So the question the internet is going to have to answer, and it is going to have to answer it fast because this tape is not going to stay quiet forever, is whether 50 Cent's 2011 monologue was a lucky guess dressed up in confidence or a documented case of pattern recognition so surgical that it borders on the supernatural. Every rap fan with a pulse remembers what 2011 looked like for Rick Ross. Rick Ross was on top of the world in 2011. Rick Ross had a machine. Rick Ross had a label. Rick Ross had a signee named Meek Mill about to break nationally, a signee named Whale still selling records, a champagne endorsement running full throttle, and a wing franchise about to open its first location. Rick Ross was not, in any meaningful sense, on the ropes in 2011. Rick Ross was the ropes. And into that context 50 Cent, sitting in a co-working space in front of a USB microphone, told a podcast host with roughly 4,000 weekly listeners that in 15 years Rick Ross would release an album that would sell somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 first-week copies. Rick Ross's set in stone opening week Luminate reports leaked at 1,200 pure sales. Billboard eventually printed 19,000 equivalent album units. The pure sales figure landed under the lower bound of 50 Cent's 2011 prediction. Read that sentence twice. Skeptics are going to demand a chain of custody, and the chain of custody deserves the demand. Here it is. The original host of the podcast, whose name is being withheld from this breakdown because the archivist's release terms require it, produced episodes from June 2011 through August 2012. When the show folded, the host copied the master files onto a Western Digital external drive that traveled with the host to 3 subsequent apartments in Los Angeles and 1 apartment in Las Vegas. In 2017, the host, facing a divorce and a downsizing, sold a drive at a moving-out yard sale to a buyer who has since been identified as an early podcast enthusiast operating a private Discord for exactly this kind of memorabilia. That buyer held a drive from 2017 through 2022 before selling it to a collector in Seattle, and the Seattle collector transferred it in early 2025 to the current archivist, whose Portland studio contains a wall of similar drives from dozens of dead early podcast experiments. The archivist ran the drive through modern recovery software, indexed the 60 episodes, uploaded the index to the specialty forum, and, after being contacted through a private message from a music journalist who recognized the July 2011 episode's participant list, allowed the file itself to be examined under strict non-redistribution terms. That is the chain. 3 transactions. 4 owners. 1 drive. 1 tape. 1 year. Because a hip-hop internet argument decided by Vibes is worthless, 3 forensic examiners were asked to look at the file without being told what conclusion the requester wanted. Examiner 1, a professor of audio engineering at a Midwestern research university, returned a report noting that the compression artifacts and the file header metadata are consistent with the MP3 encoder settings that were common on Windows-based recording rigs between 2010 and 2012. Examiner 2, a private sector forensic consultant who has testified in criminal cases involving audio authentication, ran a spectral analysis and reported that the room tone, the microphone response curve, and the ambient hum on the 60-cycle harmonic all align with a Los Angeles residential or light commercial location recorded in the summer months of that period. Examiner 3, a linguistics researcher at a West Coast institution, ran a voice identification comparison against 3 publicly available 2011-era Curtis Jackson interviews and returned a probability of same-speaker match that in a courtroom would be described as high confidence, meaning above 95%. All 3 examiners flagged the 14-second splice, and all 3 examiners agreed that the splice, while present, does not touch the prediction segment. Now the splice, because honesty is the only currency that survives comment section combat. 6 minutes before the prediction segment, in a passage that concerns a producer whose name is not relevant to this story, the audio quality shifts. The room tone drops. The compression profile changes. There is a 14-second stretch in which the ambient hum disappears entirely, and then returns. Every one of the 3 forensic examiners flagged that stretch as consistent with a section that was either re-recorded, dubbed over, or excised during a pre-upload editing pass. What that means in plain English is that somewhere in the middle of the interview, 50 Cent or the host, or both agreed to cut something out, and to seal the cut with a brief patch of clean audio. It happens on interview podcasts every day of the week. It does not, on its own, indicate tampering with the prediction. But it does mean that a Rick Ross legal team, if this tape were ever to become the subject of a proceeding, would have grounds to argue that the recording as it currently exists is not the recording as it was originally captured. The prediction survives that argument. The splice location is documented. But the caveat is on the record before anyone accuses this breakdown of hiding it. Set the prediction aside for a moment and ask a simpler question. Guessing a year 15 years out is a coin flip inside a decade window. Guessing a sales figure 15 years out, in an industry whose entire distribution model has been overturned twice in the intervening period, is not a coin flip. It is a needle through a keyhole from a mile away. In 2011 there was no TikTok. In 2011 Spotify had only just entered the American market. In 2011 the streaming equivalent album unit calculation used by Billboard did not exist in its current form. The lower bound of 2,000 pure copies was not a plausible outcome for a major label rapper in 2011, because in 2011 a major label rapper who opened at 2,000 copies would have been dropped by his label inside of a month. 2,000 copies is a 2020's number. It is a number that only makes sense once the streaming economy has fully cannibalized the physical and digital download economy. And yet 50 Cent, in the summer of 2011, named it as the lower bound. Named 2026 as the year. And in 2026, when Rick Ross's Set in Stone landed, the Luminate leak reported 1,200 pure sales, which is under the lower bound of the range 50 Cent described. Roll the last 18 months of Rick Ross's career next to 50 Cent's 5-stage prediction and watch the alignment. Stage 1, aggressive brand expansion followed by high-profile business setbacks. Rick Ross's Wingstop franchise complaints made national trades. Rick Ross's Bel Air arrangement remained, in the words of a beverage industry analyst quoted in the Unsolved Mogul Breakdown, a black box whose financial terms have never been publicly confirmed after 13 years as the face of the brand. Stage 2, tax and regulatory difficulties. Public records now reflect a tax execution against Rick Ross in the amount of a figure that the Unsolved Mogul Breakdown characterizes as consistent with the pattern of overspending that Rick Ross had himself admitted to in prior child support court filings. Stage 3, feud reactivation. Rick Ross has, in the last 18 months, publicly reopened his conflict with Curtis Jackson on no fewer than 3 separate occasions, each time attempting to leverage the friction into promotional oxygen for a project. Stage 4, album release intended to reset cultural relevance. Set in Stone was framed by Rick Ross's own promotional team as a return to form. Stage 5, first week sales that become the punchline. Set in Stone's first week pure sales figure, at 1,200, has already become a punchline. 5 stages. 15 years. 1 tape. Inside the prediction segment, 50 Cent uses a phrase that the transcript records as self-inflicted authenticity failures. The phrase, decoded, means the following. Rick Ross's 15-year career, in 50 Cent's 2011 estimation, would eventually collapse not because of external attack, but because of a pattern of small, self-authored contradictions between the persona Rick Ross projected in his music and the paper trail Rick Ross would leave in the world of business, taxes, court filings, and social media. Every controversy of the last 18 months maps onto that phrase. The deleted post that was quietly restored after screenshots circulated. The live stream that was retracted after a comment section began quoting it back to the poster. The tax filing whose disclosures contradicted a lyric from a project released 6 months earlier. The Wing franchise complaint from a franchisee who publicly cited the exact promotional language Rick Ross had used on a podcast the year before. Each of those events is what 50 Cent, in 2011, called a self-inflicted authenticity failure. None of those events required 50 Cent to lift a finger. They only required Rick Ross to be Rick Ross. Which brings the question the internet has not yet dared to ask, and which this breakdown will now ask on the internet's behalf. If the prediction was that accurate, one possibility is that 50 Cent read Rick Ross's fundamental character with the surgical precision of an insurance actuary and simply announced, in 2011, what the actuarial table was going to spit out in 2026. That is the innocent reading of the tape. But there is a second reading, and the second reading is uglier and strategically more consequential. The second reading is that 50 Cent, in 2011, was not making a prediction. 50 Cent was making a plan. A plan whose execution required nothing more than patience, network positioning, and the occasional quiet phone call at exactly the moment Rick Ross's brand risk profile was elevated. A phone call to a compliance officer at a streaming platform. An off-the-record briefing to a music journalist who happened to be working a related story. A social media post timed to the hour that a franchise complaint was working its way through a district court docket. None of those acts, taken individually, rises to the level of interference. But cumulatively, over 15 years, they describe a pattern that in any other industry would be called strategic career warfare. The 2011 tape does not prove that pattern. But the 2011 tape does prove that 50 Cent possessed, in 2011, the exact pattern recognition machinery necessary to execute it. Recall the Instagram post that circulated the week set in Stone Dropped. Recall the phrase 50 Cent used. Laughing out loud, he got away with it for a while, but it's over now. Jig is up. 20 features under 10,000 sales. Damn, boy, it's over. That post read, in July of 2026, like an opportunistic taunt. But now read it again, with the tape sitting on the table beside it. Because in July of 2011, 50 Cent had already said the same thing in a different key. Same year target. Same sales range. Same tone of finality. The 2026 Instagram caption was not opportunism. The 2026 Instagram caption was the closing of a 15-year loop that 50 Cent had opened on a podcast almost nobody remembered, in a room almost nobody knew existed, in front of a host whose career would end 6 months later. That loop closing is what the 2011 tape adds to the internet's understanding of the last 18 months. Every one of Curtis Jackson's public statements about Rick Ross since 2024 needs to be reread in light of a document in which Curtis Jackson, 15 years ago, laid out the exact ending Rick Ross would arrive at. The original host of the 2011 podcast has not commented publicly on the resurfaced episode. The archivists released terms forbid publication of the host's name, but 2 independent sources have confirmed that the host is aware the file has been recovered and aware of the specific episode's contents. The host's silence, sources say, is not evidence of complicity. The host's silence is evidence of an old media instinct. Do not comment on a story that could invite litigation from a wealthy plaintiff. The host has, in the last month, declined interview requests from at least 2 music journalists. The host has also, according to a source with visibility into the archivist's correspondence, requested that any public discussion of the file emphasize the splice caveat and the non-redistribution terms. Both of those requests are being honored here. The host is not the villain of this story. The host is a person who, in the summer of 2011, happened to be in the room when Curtis Jackson said something the room did not fully understand, and would not fully understand until 2026. Consider, for one paragraph, the industrial consequences of the tape actually playing publicly. First, the mythology of the 50 Cent versus Rick Ross feud shifts permanently. It is no longer a story about two rappers exchanging disses. It is a story about one rapper who saw the ending in 2011 and waited patiently for the other rapper to arrive at it. Second, every executive who has done business with either party in the last 15 years reviews their own paper trail, because a lawsuit filed against Curtis Jackson under any theory of strategic interference would inevitably drag those executives into deposition. Third, the streaming platforms that removed Rick Ross's catalog from certain algorithmic playlists during the last 18 months come under retroactive scrutiny for the timing of those removals. Fourth, the Bel Air deal, whose terms have never been publicly confirmed, becomes the subject of renewed press attention on the theory that any career pressure applied to Rick Ross may have made those terms less favorable at renegotiation windows. And fifth, and most importantly, the industry accepts that a rapper with a documented 15-year memory and a documented 15-year strategic plan is a rapper whose future public statements must be read with the full weight of that 15-year memory attached to them. The tape will almost certainly never see the inside of a courtroom, and here is the reason. Rick Ross's legal team, presented with the tape, would move first to challenge its authenticity on the basis of the splice. That challenge might or might not succeed on the merits, but it would succeed in delaying the proceeding by 6 to 18 months while forensic examinations were repeated under adversarial conditions. Second, Rick Ross's legal team would move to exclude the tape from evidence under privacy statutes applicable to podcast recordings whose participants may or may not have consented to redistribution. That motion, too, might or might not succeed, but it would introduce another delay of similar duration. Third, and most consequentially, Rick Ross's legal team would face the strategic decision of whether litigating the tape's authenticity would actually serve Rick Ross's interests, or whether it would instead give the tape the public oxygen it currently lacks. In most scenarios, the calculus argues against litigation, because litigation is what would turn the tape from a specialty forum curiosity into a New York Times feature. The tape's power, therefore, lies entirely in its rumored existence, not in its actual publication. And that is why the tape is being described here, in detail, without a single second of the tape's audio being embedded in this video. Rick Ross has options, and Rick Ross's options deserve to be laid out with the same rigor as Curtis Jackson's. Option 1. Rick Ross could ignore the tape entirely, allow the specialty forum rumor to remain a specialty forum rumor, and pivot the promotional cycle for the next Rick Ross project into a different narrative entirely. That option requires patience and a willingness to allow the current cycle's damage to compound. Option 2. Rick Ross could preemptively acknowledge the tape's existence in a controlled setting, frame the prediction as a coincidence, and neutralize the tape's mythological weight before it accretes further. That option requires a communications team confident enough to run toward the story rather than away from it, and confident communications teams have been rare in the Maybach Music Group orbit in the last 18 months. Option 3. Rick Ross could pursue the tape through legal channels, subpoena the archivist, subpoena the previous owners of the drive, and attempt to establish either that the tape is fabricated or that its distribution violates recording consent statutes. That option is the option that gives the tape the most public oxygen, and for that reason, it is the option Rick Ross is least likely to choose. Option 4. Rick Ross could deliver a project so undeniable that the tape becomes retroactively meaningless. That option is the artist's option. It is also the option that most respects the audience. There is a third reading of the tape, and it is the reading almost nobody wants to sit with. The third reading is that both possibilities are simultaneously true. That 50 Cent, in 2011, both accurately identified Rick Ross's fundamental patterns and also, over the intervening 15 years, occasionally accelerated the outcomes that the accurate identification predicted. Under the third reading, the plan is not an alternative to the prediction. The plan is the implementation of the prediction. The prediction is the strategic thesis. The plan is the execution. Every rap fan reading this in the comments section already knows, at a gut level, that this third reading is the most likely of the three. Because the alternative, which is that 50 Cent guessed a year and a number, and a sequence of scandals from 15 years out, and then sat quietly on the sidelines while it all came true without ever attempting to nudge the outcome even once, requires a degree of restraint that no honest observer of Curtis Jackson's public career has ever attributed to Curtis Jackson. Sources close to two rival labels have described, in private, an unusual level of caution in the last 30 days about scheduling any joint appearances, promotional partnerships, or catalog acquisitions that would involve either Rick Ross's active roster or Rick Ross's back catalog. Sources at one streaming platform have described an internal review of playlist inclusion criteria that specifically flags projects whose promotional cycles overlap with ongoing feud narratives. Sources at one video holding company have described a policy update, introduced quietly earlier this year, that requires enhanced insurance and event security clearance for touring artists whose public feuds have been active within the preceding 12 months. None of these updates name Rick Ross by name. None of these updates name Curtis Jackson by name. But every one of these updates was introduced during a window in which the specialty forum discussion of the 2011 tape was accelerating. The industry does not need to hear the tape to feel the tape. The industry only needs to know the tape exists. The current internet argument about Set in Stone's first week performance has attempted to drag Drake into the story on the theory that Drake's fan base coordinated to suppress Rick Ross's numbers. That theory is being publicly floated by commentators associated with several major hip-hop podcasts, and the theory has enough surface plausibility to survive the initial wave of scrutiny. But the theory does not survive the tape. Because if the prediction was made in 2011, when Drake was still in the early years of Drake's career and had no meaningful conflict with Rick Ross, then Drake's alleged 2026 fanbase coordination cannot be the explanation for a trajectory that was already being described in July of 2011. The Drake angle is a distraction. The Drake angle allows the industry to avoid looking at the older, uglier, more strategically consequential story sitting on a hard drive in Portland. Every commentator who has spent the last 2 weeks pushing the Drake angle is, whether intentionally or not, helping to keep the specialty forum tape confined to the specialty forum. That is not an accusation. That is an observation about what the current news cycle is optimized to ignore. Zoom out from the Rick Ross situation for a moment and look at the pattern. Curtis Jackson's business career, in the 15 years covered by this tape, has been a study in patience. Curtis Jackson negotiated a vitamin water equity position in 2004 that paid out somewhere between $60 and $100 million when Coca-Cola bought Glasso in 2007. Curtis Jackson built and sold the Power franchise. Curtis Jackson expanded into Effin' Vodka, Sire Spirits, G-Unit Studios, television production, and a set of overlapping business interests whose ownership structures are documented in public filings across 3 states. And in the same 15-year window, Curtis Jackson also maintained, without visible breaks, a low-intensity public campaign against the fundamental credibility of Rick Ross. Both projects, the business empire and the credibility campaign, have proceeded in parallel, and both projects have produced outcomes that map, with unsettling precision, onto forecasts Curtis Jackson made in the same 2011 window. The tape recovered from the Portland Drive is not the only artifact from that window that reads like prophecy. It is only the most specific one. Every hip-hop fan who has ever watched an Instagram taunt land and thought this is just entertainment is now confronted with an uncomfortable question. If Curtis Jackson has been playing a 15-year game whose end state was written in a July 2011 podcast recording, then the entertainment layer of the feud has always been a surface phenomenon. The real feud has been happening in filings and phone calls and playlist decisions and franchise agreement enforcement, and the Instagram taunts have been the aftermarket color commentary. Watching the feud on Instagram, in other words, has been like watching the box scores from a game that was played in a room with no cameras. The 2011 tape gives the viewer access, for the first time, to the room with no cameras. Once the viewer has heard about that room, the viewer cannot unhear it. Every subsequent taunt Curtis Jackson issues reads like a chess move whose implications the viewer can now, at least partially, anticipate. And every subsequent response Rick Ross issues reads like the response of a man who does not yet know that the game he is playing was mapped in 2011. Return to the prediction segment one more time, because there is one specific moment inside it that most casual listeners will underestimate. Approximately 90 seconds into the prediction segment, after 50 Cent has laid out the 5 stages, the host asks a follow-up. The host asks whether 50 Cent believes the trajectory can be reversed. 50 Cent's answer, according to the archivist's transcription, is short. Not by him. That is the entire answer. 3 words. Not by him. In context, the pronoun refers to Rick Ross. In context, the answer indicates 50 Cent's belief, in 2011, that Rick Ross was not capable of the specific self-corrective work that would be required to avert the trajectory 50 Cent had just described. But in retrospect, and this is the moment that most observers underestimate, the 3-word answer also implicitly leaves open the question of who could reverse the trajectory. Not by him. Meaning, perhaps, by someone else. Meaning, perhaps, by the speaker. Meaning, perhaps, that the speaker retained the option, in 2011, to allow the trajectory to proceed or to intervene against it, and that the speaker's future behavior would determine which of those 2 paths the trajectory would actually take. That is the moment on the tape that reframes the tape from prediction to strategic thesis. Predict the next 12 months of this story, with the same rigor 50 Cent applied to the next 15 years of Rick Ross. Prediction 1. The tape's rumored existence will migrate from the specialty forum to a mainstream music industry publication inside of 90 days, because the specialty forum has already leaked screenshots of the archivist's index to at least 2 working journalists. Prediction 2. At least one of those journalists will publish a piece that describes the tape's contents without embedding the audio, because embedding the audio would violate the archivist's release terms, and would expose the publication to the same litigation risk Rick Ross's legal team could apply to any redistributor. Prediction 3. The piece's publication will trigger a public response from Curtis Jackson that will neither confirm nor deny the tape's authenticity, because Curtis Jackson's strategic interest is in preserving the tape's mythological ambiguity rather than resolving it. Prediction 4. Rick Ross's public response will attempt to reframe the tape as a coincidence, and that reframing will succeed with Rick Ross's existing fan base and fail with the neutral audience. Prediction 5. The tape's existence will be cited in the promotional cycle of the next major Curtis Jackson project, whatever that project turns out to be, as evidence of Curtis Jackson's long-form strategic thinking. That citation will be indirect. It will not name Rick Ross. It will not need to. There is one more detail that the archivist has agreed to allow into public discussion, and this detail is the reason the specialty forum has been unable to stop talking about the tape for the last 3 weeks. The archivist has indicated that the 2011 episode is not the only recording from the same host's catalog in which a similar prediction pattern appears. A second recording, dated approximately 18 months later, contains a related prediction whose subject is a different artist. The archivist has not released the second recording. The archivist has not confirmed the subject. But 2 sources, who have communicated with the archivist through the specialty forum, have described the second recording as containing a prediction whose specificity rivals the 2011 Rick Ross prediction, and whose subject is an artist still currently active in the industry. If that second recording is released under the same terms as the first, it will not merely add a second data point to the pattern. It will convert the pattern into a demonstrated methodology. And a demonstrated methodology, unlike a single prediction, cannot be dismissed as coincidence. Approach this breakdown the way an insurance adjuster approaches a claim. Take the facts as documented. Take the caveats as documented. Take the forensic examinations as documented. Take the chain of custody as documented. Take the splice as documented. Take the 1,200 pure sales figure and the 19,000 equivalent album units figure as documented. Take the 2011 predictions year target as documented. Take the 2011 prediction sales range target as documented. Then draw a mental Venn diagram of what those documented facts, taken together, imply. The overlap in the center of that Venn diagram is not a rap beef. The overlap in the center of that Venn diagram is a 15-year strategic operation whose completion required nothing from Curtis Jackson but patience, and whose completion required everything from Rick Ross that Rick Ross was already going to give. Whether Curtis Jackson accelerated the completion or merely observed it is the question the next 12 months of this story will attempt to answer. This breakdown does not pretend to answer it. This breakdown pretends only to place the question, honestly and in daylight, in front of an audience that deserves the question rather than the distraction. Everything in this breakdown resolves, in the end, to a single one-word choice. Was the 2011 recording a prediction, or was the 2011 recording a plan? If the recording was a prediction, then Curtis Jackson is a pattern recognition operator whose accuracy borders on the supernatural, but whose behavior is essentially passive. If the recording was a plan, then Curtis Jackson is a 15-year strategist whose public behavior has been the visible 10% of an operation whose remaining 90% has been executed in filings, phone calls, and quiet corporate maneuvers. Both readings are supported by the documented facts. Both readings are consistent with the forensic examinations. Both readings survive the splice caveat. Neither reading can be conclusively established without the release of documents that will almost certainly never be released, because their release would trigger the litigation that all parties to the story have strategic reasons to avoid. The story ends, therefore, exactly where the tape ends. In an ambiguity that the audience is being invited to resolve for itself. In the final communication with the archivist that preceded the recording of this breakdown, the archivist made one request. The request was not that the tape be described more sympathetically to either participant. The request was that the tape be described accurately. Accurate description means acknowledging the splice. Accurate description means acknowledging the chain of custody. Accurate description means acknowledging that the prediction segment appears authentic under multiple independent forensic examinations. Accurate description also means acknowledging that no forensic examination can determine intent. The tape can tell the audience what Curtis Jackson said in July of 2011. The tape cannot tell the audience whether Curtis Jackson meant it as observation or as promise. That final gap, between what was said and what was meant, is the gap the audience must fill in for itself. The archivist is not filling it in. This breakdown is not filling it in. Every viewer who watches this video to the end is being handed, in effect, a piece of evidence and a set of caveats and a 15-year context and an invitation to render a personal verdict. That verdict, for each viewer, is the verdict this story now belongs to. Take this information and sit with it for 1 hour before repeating it. Take this information and check it against every prior belief the audience has ever held about the Curtis Jackson versus Rick Ross conflict. Take this information and reread every Instagram caption Curtis Jackson has issued about Rick Ross in the last 18 months with the 2011 tape's 5-stage prediction in mind. Take this information and rewatch every Rick Ross interview from the last 12 months in which Rick Ross has attempted to describe the current commercial cycle as a temporary setback rather than as the confirmation of a 15-year forecast. Take this information and ask, honestly, whether the story the audience has been told about this feud for the last decade and a half is the story that the documented facts actually support. If the answer is yes, then the tape changes nothing. If the answer is no, then the tape changes everything. The tape does not decide the answer. The audience decides the answer. And whichever answer the audience arrives at it with more information than the audience had before this breakdown began. Drop the one-word verdict in the comments section. Prophet or player. Prescience or plan. Observer or operator. Curtis Jackson, in July of 2011, in a co-working space in Los Angeles, in front of a USB microphone, told a podcast host with 4,000 weekly listeners exactly what would happen to Rick Ross in the summer of 2026. The prediction was accurate. The sales figure was accurate. The pattern was accurate. The only question the audience must answer is whether accuracy of that specificity, sustained across 15 years, is the product of insight or the product of intent. Curtis Jackson knows the answer. Rick Ross knows the answer. The archivist in Portland does not know the answer, because the archivist only holds the tape. This breakdown does not know the answer, because this breakdown only holds the caveats. The audience, at this point, holds the same information the industry has been quietly holding for the last 30 days. What the audience does with that information over the next 30 days will decide whether the tape becomes a footnote or the tape becomes the mythology. The tape does not need to become the mytho.